Okay, so tomorrow is Friday, July 7th. The readings for tomorrow are Mark 5 and Galatians 3. Tomorrow is also the feast of Saint Kyriake. So let me read the highlighted text. I'm going to start with Galatians. Before faith came, we were confined under the law, kept under restraint until faith should be revealed. So the law was our custodian until Christ came, that we might be justified by faith. In Christ you are all sons of God. I'm probably not going to get to the sons of God stuff today. And Mark, she had heard the reports about Jesus and came up behind him in the crowd and touched his garment. Jesus said, "Daughter, your faith made you well. Go in peace and be healed of your disease." Okay. So I talked yesterday about the conditions under which engaging with the instinctual nature or the unconscious might be understood in a way other than how it's typically understood in contemporary Christian denominations, which sees it usually as a demonic practice, and the way that it can be understood as something other than a demonic practice is under the conditions of an intentional attempt to understand the symbolic and representational content of the instinctual nature, or the objective basis of conscious contents. And the suggestion was that the manner in which one can experience the instinctual nature in a way that one does not become possessed by it, in this way fulfills the law of Christ. So the law of Christ is the manner in which you approach the instinctual nature, and the best way to do it, as far as I can tell psychologically, is through the unconscious, which provides not the actions, instinctual action, but symbolic representation of the instincts. So today I'm going to say a little bit more about what this attitude towards the unconscious is, and we'll do so under the rubric of saintliness, right? So fulfilling the law of Christ is the goal of the saint, and we'll do that because a couple of reasons, but one is that tomorrow happens to be the feast of Saint Kyriake, who was a woman in early Christianity who was supposed to be, a rich person wanted her to marry his son, and she basically said that she was spiritually married to Christ and that she wouldn't do it, and so they beat her family and killed her. Essentially, it took a while, but eventually they just killed her. And that has a lot to do with, I don't know if it's directly tied to her not wanting to marry this dude, although probably part of it, but I think it was during the Roman Empire where they were hostile to Christians, and so basically once she scorned that guy, they used it as an excuse to rat her out as a Christian, and then they persecuted her as a Christian because Romans weren't cool with Christians at that time. All right, so the descent into the unconscious with the attitude of a saint, I think, can be roughly understood as the imitation of Christ's descent into hell, which was done not for the purpose of becoming possessed by the inhabitants of hell, but Christ preached to them. And so one idea is maybe it's not a preaching, but it's just a witness of the unconscious contents. And that through faith, the encounter will essentially lead you towards the indestructible hypostasis beyond the always already outmoded adaptations of material nature. I talked about that in a prior video. The idea is that, except to the extent that it embodies the indestructible or divine hypostasis, the actions of the human being in the world always are recapitulations of some prior mode of adaptation, and so to that extent they're evil because they don't represent the spontaneity of the hypostasis. So put simply, saintliness is the manner in which one undergoes the torments of the adaptive material nature, in this case the torments of the symbols of the unconscious, which are apparently demonic, often understood as evil by Christians. And so the distinction here is that someone who engages with their unconscious is not participating in its symbols in a way that animates their actions, but rather they're witnessing the objective basis of conscious contents in the symbolic representation of the instinctual nature, which are the images that the unconscious just spontaneously provides. And that is for the purpose. So if you approach the unconscious in the attitude of witness and the intent to encounter their hypostatic source. So the idea is that instinctual nature derives from the hypostatic source. So the intention of witnessing unconscious contents for the purpose of coming to know their hypostatic source, what could be demonic about that? So the faith that endures hell is the manner by which one touches the garment of Christ, as we read today, and is led towards justification, which is the encounter with the hypostatic person. Faith endures the torments of the unconscious, knowing it is both real and unreal. So this is a part of the attitude. So the symbols of the instinctual nature, which are typically understood as evil because they're outmoded forms of adaptation, are real because they're products of the unconscious, and as those products are suggested to be the road to salvation, but unreal as cursory or preliminary to the hypostatic encounter, which is the encounter with the essentially justification personified, the image of Christ, all of that. Okay, so what evidence, one might ask, is there for the possibility of this hypostatic justification, and what is the result? So I'm going to start at the end, which is the result. The result is a unwilled or natural regeneration of consciousness, also the transformation of unconscious instinctual drives, the purification of adaptive material nature, or the cure of what we talked about psychologically as preconception as symptom. Okay, and so in this process, nowhere is it more important to be able to let go, and here letting go is the idea of letting go not of the object of desire, the symbol of the instinctual process, which is a symptom, but letting go of the resistance to the natural source of its overcoming. So the idea is that the descent into the unconscious, and the witnessing of the symbolic instinct, what you have to let go of is the resistance to the possibility of their transformation. And so typically this is where it gets demonic for dogmatic Christianity, because the idea is that if the symbols of the evil instinct lives in the unconscious, then a descent into the unconscious and their witnessing, the only possibility of the unconscious is demonic, essentially. And so there's no possibility that in letting go, some good force essentially might arise. And so it's critical to let go of the preconception here that all the unconscious does is evil things, because the idea is that it is also the seat of the regenerative nature. Okay, so that's the outcome. And so then the question is, what is the evidence of this possibility? We talked previously about the way in which one cannot simply detach themselves from conscious contents as the manner of the cure, essentially, because the attempt there is essentially coextensive with its object. And so consciousness can't detach from itself, can't detach from objects of itself. Essentially, you have to reach a different ontological stratum, and that is the means of detachment, because you're going from one place to another. So what is the evidence then that there is this regenerative property in the unconscious? So what I'll say about it today, I mean, briefly, it's related to the child that we read about in the readings, but what I'll say about it today and say more about tomorrow is essentially there's a metaphor here between the physical and the psychical nature, or the mental nature, although mental doesn't do it justice because it's cyclical in the sense that it includes conscious and unconscious contents. Okay, so look to the body as a metaphor, and essentially when the body is injured, there's this natural regenerative quality of it that heals the wound. And so the proposition here is that some similar regenerative nature exists in the psyche, being conscious and unconscious contents. But of course, what we've been saying is that often this regenerative nature of the unconscious is confused with some demonic element because of the way it surprises someone. So when one is encountering the symbols of the instinctual nature, one would be surprised to learn if among all of the chaos of the instinctual symbolism, there also exists this regenerative property. And so often this regenerative property is seen as an attack, and it is an attack. It's an attack on the conscious object of desire. So the unconscious regenerative element has energy directed towards the object of conscious desire. And the idea is that the process of that energy directed towards the conscious contents is directed not just at the object, but also kind of the mechanism of desire itself. And so it's the desire itself and not the object of desire that's the source of suffering, and it's the mechanism of desire that the regenerative property of the unconscious is directed towards and that can dissolve. And so this dissolving of the mechanism of desire is that from which the regenerative nature of the unconscious, which is also the divine hypostasis, releases us.